Good morning, everyone. My name is Artem. This is Jack, Sirius and Pratik. We're going to be going over our economics research project, the impact of the ban on willful defiance suspensions and teacher transfers. Here is a table of contents. So there's going to be 6 things we're going to be going over. The first thing is project overview.
Then we'll talk about the background of willful defiance suspension.
Then we're going to be going over the research question and literature.
Then we're going to do a general overview on the data.
After that, we'll be going over the methodologies and results that we obtained, and then we'll be concluding and discussing what those results mean.
So, what makes our project different is that we're looking at California's 2024 willful defiance suspension ban, but from a completely different angle. We're not just looking at students, we're going to be looking at full-time educators as they make up a big part of the education economy. So first of all, we're going to combine county-level income data, staffing, and suspension trends, and then we ran a linear regression model, and we found that by connecting discipline policies to employment trends, we're showing that changes meant for students can have a much bigger ripple effect in the education workforce than people might expect.
A willful defiance suspension is a suspension a student can get from the classroom due to refusing to follow school staff authority and disrupting school activities. This broad definition has allowed many students to be suspended for minor and controversial incidents, such as not following a class direction, dress code violations, talking back to a teacher, and not having the correct classroom supplies.
So here we have a timeline. If we look at the very start of the timeline, back in the fall of 2013, LA Unified District made a big move. They banned expulsions and suspensions for willful defiance. And this was not just a big move, it was a turning point in this field as schools had to address this discipline in a different way. They could no longer remove students from classes or schools. They had to find a different way to address this behavior. And it didn't just stop there. It set the path for more reforms in the future for different districts across the state.
Next, on January 1st, 2015, Assembly Bill 420 was put into effect that prohibited all California public schools to suspend kindergarten through 3rd grade students due to willful defiance and disobedience.
And then, in July 1st of 2020, Senate Bill 419 was passed to expand this onto grades 4 to 5, effectively banning willful defiance suspensions for elementary schoolers.
And then on October 8th, 2023, Governor Gavin Newsom signed this bill, and that's set to expire on July 1st, 2029.
Lastly, on July 1st, 2024, the willful defiance suspension ban for all K through 12 students in public California high schools came into effect thanks to Senate Bill 274, signed in order to address concerns about subjective discipline, teacher bias, and the negative impact on student wellness that suspension bans brought about.
All right. So from previous findings from doing work on other literature, we saw that before the ban was passed, that willful defiance suspensions mainly targeted Black students, particularly at a disproportional rate. So we wanted to see that following the ban, whether or not teachers would have experienced increased stress due to reporting lower levels of control, since these kids would have stayed in school regardless. So this brings us to our research question, which is the following. How did the number of teachers per student change after the willful defiance suspension ban?
Going into this research, we came up with 2 hypotheses explaining how willful defiance suspensions can affect the amount of teachers. Our first hypothesis follows the supply side and states that if the ban were to go into effect, teachers would feel a decrease of control and would more likely leave or transfer their school due to this negative feeling. Our second hypothesis shows the demand side and argues that schools will try to respond to this ban by trying to hire more teachers in an effort to maintain control, thus increasing the overall demand for teaching staff. If our results are able to find a causal increase or decrease in the amount of teachers due to this ban, it demonstrates a stronger effect and provides evidence for our corresponding hypothesis.
So when you look at the research, we used 5 sources. There's a pretty clear pattern when you look at these sources. Suspension bans, even ones aimed at willful defiance, are meant to cut down on exclusionary discipline, but the results are mixed. Some studies find only small drops in suspensions overall, and the gaps for marginalized students often stick around, and sometimes they even get worse. So the key takeaway from all of this is that changing policy on paper is not enough. Without deeper cultural and structural changes, those inequities will stay in place. And that's where our research question comes in. If these bans shift disciplinary practices unevenly, that could affect teachers too. Things like their working conditions and whether they choose to stay or move schools. By looking at the 2024 willful defiance ban and teacher transfers, we're exploring whether these policies send ripples through the educated workforce, not just the student body. So here is our research design. We used a 5-step process, and the very first process is the data collection process. So for this part of the analysis, we started by pulling together 4 key data sets from the years 2011 to 2019. We looked at suspension records, we looked at teacher salary data, we looked at county level income and population statistics. And when you put all of that together, you get this one massive key data set, and it gives us a pretty solid picture of what's going on. And it let us dig into how changes in discipline policy connect staffing trends across California schools.
Then after that, in order to create one cohesive data set, we had to integrate the data together and clean it to ensure that we got rid of any unnecessary and missing variable.
Then we went into variable selection, focusing on suspensions, income, and population numbers, and how they relate to full-time teachers in order to try and identify any third factors that might have unseen impacts on our results.
And then in order to obtain our results through statistical analysis in Python, we were able to run linear regression in order to find any causal relationships. And then finally, we visualized this data through graphs in which we were able to see overall trends. So let's start going over the data and methodology. So once we were able to clean and integrate the data, we had one big merged data set. And this was structured as panel data. And this was important because this allowed us to track several variables and see whether or not they were changing over time or whether or not they stayed. So once again, this allowed us to track the same unit over time. And for our project, just to reiterate, our dependent variable was the number of full-time teachers per 1,000 pupils or students. And then our independent variable was whether or not a school district had implemented the ban. And for our sample size, we chose the time period 2011 to 2019. The reason we stopped at 2019 was because after that, there was obviously COVID-19, and that caused schools to shut down and go remote. So suspensions wouldn't really be relevant. So even though the ban was passed in 2024, we're going to be looking at several counties that implemented it before that and to compare it with those that didn't. And then for the area of interest, we only chose high schools in California and disregarded elementary and middle schools because we saw that most of these suspensions were occurring in high schools. And so like including middle schools and elementary schools would be kind of irrelevant. So once we had the one big merged data set, we were able to pull data from 1,510 high schools across the state from the school year 2011-2012 to 2018-2019. And then we had a total number of 9,310 observations. All right. So the inference strategy we used in order to obtain our results was difference in differences, or DID in short. So what this essentially does is that it allows us to compare two groups, one that's affected by the ban and one that's not. So in this sort of way, it's sort of like a treatment. So the one being affected by the ban being the treatment group, and the one that's not being the control group. So for the treatment group, there were 4 school districts in California that had implemented the ban before 2019. So these were Azusa Unified School District, Oakland Unified School District, Pasadena Unified School District, and San Francisco Unified School District, all of which passed the ban in 2016. And for a control group, all the other school districts were part of it. And so what this inference strategy does is it allows us to make sure that both the treatment and control group are similar before the ban, and whatever the difference is after the ban can solely be attributed to the ban. Now you might be wondering, the first school district to pass the ban was LA Unified School District in 2013, looking back at the timeline. So why isn't that part of this treatment? Well, in order to run this inference strategy, we have to have a key assumption, which is that both the treatment and control groups have to be the same before the ban. And when we included LA Unified School District in this, we saw that the two different lines were different and that they weren't parallel. So we couldn't include LA Unified School District in our methodology.
Great. So in order to find the difference and the variables that we wanted to understand the effects of, we used a linear regression technique. which essentially is a linear equation that we all know as y equals to mx plus b. But this time there are many x's because there are many different variables that can have an effect. But the one we're most interested in is the one that is the treatment and post-treatment variable, which is the coefficient beta 3, which affects how much the treatment plays a role. As we see here in the pre-treatment group, 1 represents the schools that are in the treatment group and 0 for the control group. Then in the post-treatment group, we use 1 for the schools where the ban is implemented to see any changes. Here we use treatment by post-treatment in order to capture the causal effect of the ban. And here we found the dependent and independent and control variables that we looked at. So the dependent variable we looked at was the number of teachers per 1,000 pupils. We found that under the ban, there were 41.61 teachers on average in schools with a standard deviation of 13.29. And then here, our independent variable under the ban, we found that 4% of schools actually implemented this ban throughout California. And here, in order to normalize everything and understand the proportions of students being affected by this ban, we used a control variable of enrollments per school, which we found was on average 1,225 students per school. And here, we also looked at factors such as the number of willful defiant suspensions for Black and Hispanic students, because those are the students who are being disproportionately affected by this ban. And so we also looked at other variables as well, such as population, income, and salary. And we also looked at the share of charter schools, which also has different standards. And we found that 20% of charter schools actually implemented this ban. And here in the results, we see these two different graphs. And what you mentioned earlier, that LA Unified was the first to implement this ban. However, we included them here, but you can see that these lines are not parallel to each other and they have different trends. That did not meet our assumption. So we look over here on this right-hand graph where these two lines are parallel in trend. However, after 2015, where the ban was passed, we see that here, this slope is higher and it's increasing. So we did see an effect on the ban because after all, in a linear equation, when you change the slope m, you get a different slope, meaning that you can go from here to here if you change m. After this, we saw that after the ban is implemented in 2016, we saw that the number of teachers per 1,000 pupils increased by 2.37 teachers. And we were able to correctly reject the fact that there was no change, as evidenced by the increase in teachers.
So if we go over a quick recap and a conclusion, some districts like LA Unified School District and San Francisco Unified School District put willful defiance suspension ban in place years before the state made it mandatory. And that timing difference was actually really, really useful to us because it meant we could compare the early adopters to the later ones and see how local leadership and how prepared a district was.
And then using novel data sets from places such as the California Department of Education, we were able to obtain data in order to apply a DID approach.
And from this DID approach, we did find that the number of teachers causally increased.
Additionally, due to our results providing a causal increase in the number of teachers, we were able to determine that the effect of willful defiance bans in California public high schools usually increase the amount of teachers, most likely due to the schools having a greater demand for teachers in order to maintain a higher level of control, which was decreased when the ban was put into place, as hypothesized in our second hypothesis.
And finally, to piggyback off of what Art was saying in the project overview, our research was different from previous literatures in the fact that we focused on how this ban had affected the teachers and not just the students. And this ultimately offered a broader view of the public ban. And finally, we want to thank our mentor, Soto, for being such a great helper in our research. And thank you all for listening to our presentation.